Hi, nice to meet you. Can I take my jacket off? Yeah, that's completely fine. Go ahead. Okay, thanks. Okay, so this is a roleplay section. The prompt is right in front of you. So before you get started, I will be looking down at my notes and typing as you go through the interview. So I'm just letting you know, just so you aren't startled anyway, you don't need to worry about that. And there's an actor to my side who you'll be interacting with for the next couple of minutes. Yeah, okay. So your friend James here has come back from holiday and has asked you to take care of their pet dog whilst they were away. However, when they were on holiday, you happened to lose their dog when you were taking it for a walk. And now upon arrival, you're going to have to discuss this situation with your friend. Okay, so begin whenever you're ready. Okay, thank you. Okay, I'm ready. Hi James. Hello, I've had such a long vacation. All I want to see right now is my dog. Where is he? Oh, so your dog isn't here right now. Wait, so where is he then? Well, wait, don't tell me he's lost. Yeah, he ran off by himself. No, you've got to be joking. I only went for a few days and you're telling me that you've already lost my dog. Okay, you don't need to be that angry, okay? It's just a dog, you can just get another one. What? I mean, to be honest, your dog was pretty misbehaved anyways, he kind of deserved it. No, you can't be serious. No, this is not fair. You can't be saying it's not your fault. This is actually kind of silly, man. No. Sorry. This is meant to be serious, yeah. I hope you find your dog. I mean, this is not my problem anymore. You're back. I don't need to worry about this anymore. But just remember, he's probably long gone now. It wasn't even my fault. He just went off by himself. All I did was I was walking with him and now he's gone, so... I'm not gonna see my dog again. Okay, I'll stop you there. That's the end of the station. Thank you for your time. Is that it? Oh, okay. Thank you guys. Thanks. I mean, I've definitely gotten into this university anyways. You're not getting in then. MMI stands for multiple mini interview. As the name suggests, when you're undertaking this type of interview, you go through several stations and you rotate through them. And it depends on the university how you get marked in each station. Each station is separate, and so that means that if you do badly on one section, it doesn't mean that you're going to do badly in the entire thing. Each section is a fresh start again. And it also depends on the university on how many stations you have, but the entire point is to get interviewed in a variety of different ways all through these small mini stations. So then at the end you can get like a holistic view of the candidate through these interviews. So today I'm going to give you a few tips on how you can master these MMI exams and a few things that will help you prepare for these MMI exams so you can get into whatever medical school that you'd like to get to. Now, all universities don't do MMIs. Some universities, notably Cambridge, Oxford and a few others, do panel interviews, which is where for about like 20 to 40 minutes you're sitting in front of a group of people and they just interview you for the entire lot of time. Whereas with the MMI interviews, you go through small stations and you have different people in each one. So you can't really just mess it up at the very beginning as you could with a panel interview, for example. There are a few main types of MMI stations that usually come up when you have your MMI interview. These are behavioral/general stations, roleplay stations, ethical stations, group stations, data analysis stations, NHS hot topic stations, and scenario stations. I'll go over these in a bit more detail later on in the video, but I'll just give you a brief outline in what each of these stations are if you're not familiar with them. So behavioral/general questions are things that just ask you generally about medicine or about the university or about you as a person. So something like, give me your greatest strength or give me a weakness that you have. Things like those that aren't necessarily related to medicine but feel more like job interview type of questions. But you also can get medicine type questions in this category as well, such as like, why medicine? Why do you want to be a doctor, not a nurse? Things like that. We'll come over this stuff a bit later on in this video, as I've said. Roleplay questions is the one that you saw in the skit earlier. It's where you have to act out the scene as perhaps a doctor giving bad news or perhaps as a friend admitting a mistake. It's usually always either admitting some sort of mistake or having to confront someone about something, such as whether like a colleague is drinking at work or something and you have to confront them and let them know that something's going to happen because of it. Stuff like that. That's what usually comes up in roleplay scenarios. You usually get a card giving the information that you're going to have, and then you have an actor playing the part of the victim or whatever it is, and you play along with it, and you have to be serious with that, obviously. Next up, you have ethics questions. So these ones are ethical dilemmas usually, such as like who will you save, or like you have a group of people and you have to prioritize them and list which one you'll save first. There's a lot of like saving ones, such as like with liver transplants or heart transplants. Things like those come up all the time. But not just that, there could be ethical dilemmas with certain procedures, certain groups of people, certain religions, certain things like that. These all come under ethics as well and can be asked of you in this station too. Now we have group stations, which is quite an uncommon one, and you don't really see this one that much. And it's basically where you have to work as a group to solve a task usually, and each person is still assessed individually, but the way you're assessed is how well you can work within that group and how well you can delegate tasks and things like that. NHS hot topics are hot topics within the NHS, so anything recent that might be happening, such as like junior doctor strikes at the moment and things like that, those things can actually be asked from you within the interview, and you should be expected to have somewhat of an understanding behind the NHS values and what the NHS means and the purpose of it and things like that. So anything like that falls under this category. Oh, and I forgot data analysis as well. Data analysis ones are simply that you get given a graph or a table or any sort of data. It could just be a text and you just have to analyze where it is. Sometimes you have to bring in your own knowledge, but most of the time it's just simply stating what trends you see and things like that. And finally, we have a scenario question. This is very similar to a role play, but it's more like an SJT question if you're familiar with the UCAT. So instead of having to act out the part, you just walk through with the interviewer what you would do if you were in that situation. And I forgot to add, within the general / behavioral question, that's where you'd usually find the work experience questions. But you could technically label this as its own station, but I mean, if you get asked something very general, you can bring in your work experience. So that's why I feel like it's better if you just have that all in one category. My first tip, and this one's going to be quite an obvious one, but it's something that has to be said. The first thing, and probably the most important thing that you need to do for your interview, is to practice, practice, and practice. And also practice. So what I'd recommend is to do each section one by one firstly, get familiar with the type of questions they can ask you from each section individually, and you will automatically start finding which sections you're weaker at and which sections you're stronger at. And then you can use that information to then work out which sections you might need to put more practice towards and which sections you don't need to do as much. When you're practicing, what I really recommend you do is get a friend with you to practice alongside with. So what you should do is you should ask each other questions and then give feedback on your answers to each other. This way, when you're hearing your friend give a response to you, you can see their take on something and learn from their answer and perhaps adapt your answer to include some of their good points as well. And the more and more people you ask questions to, the more viewpoints you get for the same type of questions, and the more you can learn from what other people are saying. And it's just really useful having someone physically sitting in front of you, because it's not only about the verbal cues that you pick up on when you're talking with someone, but it's about those non-verbal things as well. You need to make sure that you put yourself together, and you need to make sure that you look prepared and your posture and everything is all good as well, because that in itself can give a negative impression. If you're not sitting upright and you are very shy in the interview, you need to make sure that you give off an impression just as if it was like a job opportunity, for example. So for me, during break and lunch, I'd usually get my friends to test me with questions and I'd ask them questions as well. It's really useful to find friends that are going through the similar medical process with you and to be able to quiz each other and learn from each other's mistakes and get more and more familiar with the type of questions. And at home, what I'd sometimes even do is I'd put a huge list of questions into a wheel and I'd just spin it to get a random question and I'd try and answer it. That way I'm still not choosing a question myself that I might feel more familiar with. I'm still having that aspect of randomness and I'm still testing myself as well. Obviously this isn't as good as having someone physically in front of you, because now you have to judge your own answers. This way I think is more important if you just want to make sure that you can answer all the questions. The next tip I want to talk about is work experience and reflection in particular. You do not need to worry if you don't have work experience in a hospital or something like that. It's not that big of a problem. All you need is some experiences that you've had that you can reflect on and that you can show the following skills. Okay, there's quite a few ones here, so I'm just going to be reading them right off. Teamwork, communication, empathy, dignity, integrity, respect, competence, compassion, courage, care, resilience, problem solving, leadership, and organization. So that's pretty much all the attributes that a doctor needs to possess. And what you need to do is find a few experiences that you've had. If it was in a work experience, that's great. If it wasn't in work experience, that's still fine. If it was in volunteering, if it was in a job, anything like that, even if it was online work experience, as long as you can somehow be able to show that you can hit all of these specific qualities, that's good. I will paste these qualities down below in the description as well if you want to have a look. So what I did was I picked out 3 main experiences that I've had, and out of those 3 experiences I tried to include include all of those qualities. So some of them would have like 3 or 4, others would have like 5 qualities, others would have like only 1 or 2 really specific ones. It really depends on the experience, but I tried to pick out experiences that I could recall that had a lot of different qualities in one. So I call them speaking snippets, because they were snippets that I would be keeping in my head when I went into this interview. With these snippets, highlight the skills and qualities that were needed when you had to carry out whatever you needed to do in that scenario. And then the most important part is how this links to becoming a doctor, and how this shows that you will be a good doctor because you've learned these skills. That's always the most important part. And whenever you're doing any sort of reflection, when it comes to any sort of work experience question, you always have to bring in, okay, so the skills I learned, hey, the reason they're important is because you have to do XYZ when you're a doctor. Stuff like that is really, really important to do that, and that's always something that the interviewers look for whenever they ask a question on your work experience, or just generally any sort of experience in general. I said general like 3 or 4 times there. And the beauty of MMIs is that you don't need to learn like 10 or 11 scenarios, because if you just learn 3 or 4, you can just copy and paste those same scenarios to multiple MMI stations, because each of the MMI stations don't know what any of the other ones said. So you can go to every single interviewer and you can say the exact same story of whatever you did, as long as it relates to the question. So if one of the interviewers asks you about a time where it was stressful and you managed to alleviate that stress, you can give one scenario there. And then if the next one then asks you, show how you demonstrated teamwork in a difficult setting or something like that, if your same scenario has an aspect of teamwork in it, you can bring that same scenario again. And that's completely fine, because both interviewers don't know that you've said the same thing. And as long as what you said was really good and it was like of high quality, then you're giving yourself good marks on both sides. So honestly, don't be afraid to say the same thing again and again. Obviously, don't overuse it, especially when it's not related to the question. Don't try and shove anything in that shouldn't really be there. But if you find that you've mentioned something before which you can mention here again, then by all means do it, because it can really be useful and no one's going to know. You're just going to get good points from either side. There are different techniques and acronyms that you can learn that help with this type of reflection and being able to structure your answers, and I'll leave them in the description below as well if you want to check them out too. Just if you find that you struggle with being able to formulate how you address each part of your work experience and how you formulate that answer, I recommend looking at the description and checking out the different acronyms I have down below. Now, the next one is also a very, very important tip. Tip number 3 is to read into the medical field. Now, this is something that you probably already knew, because I mentioned earlier on this video about NHS hot topics, but the important part is, what hot topics are you meant to know about? Because I often have friends who learn so much detail into the NHS and give me facts about the NHS that I never knew myself, and it would make me worried, because am I meant to know that? If I get asked about it, am I screwed? So generally, you don't need to know that much about the NHS specifically. You need to know overall, like the NHS values is a really important thing to learn, not because they'll ask you, give me the NHS values, which if you don't know, by the way, I'll just show them on the screen. What's important about the NHS values is that you can drop them into your sentences to show that you know it. So it's more like bonus points. So anything that you learn that's really specific is just going to be bonus points to your answer. If you don't learn anything, that's not a bad thing, because they can't really ask you about something very specifically unless it's a big thing that's happened. So let me give you a few examples. Junior doctor strikes, which I've mentioned, that's a really big thing that they could potentially ask you about. Staff shortages, which kind of links to the striking and everything. Generally, how the NHS is functioning, and things about like what the NHS means. The main goal of the NHS is, it's important being familiar with that as well. You should also be pretty familiar with the roles within the NHS. Now, if you had work experience in a hospital or something, you'll be more familiar with the MDT, which is the multidisciplinary team, and this just consists of the different people that work together, and it's something that can actually be asked of you from the interviewer, not like what is the MDT, but like how does the MDT work together to provide X outcome or whatever it is. So mentioning stuff like that, being familiar with the roles of the nurse and the doctor and how they're different, and just overall what goes into the care of a patient, that's also quite important, not because they could ask you about it, but more just so you yourself can show that you know the stuff. And it does really help when you're talking about teamwork, for example. And as well as these like NHS hot topics as well, you need to be familiar with laws and like things like that. Not really laws, but let me just give you a few examples. So you need to know about what the NHS's stance is on confidentiality and how confidentiality is carried out and how important confidentiality is. You need to be very familiar with that aspect and to always make sure that you're maintaining that confidentiality and to know when you might need to break that confidentiality. That is stuff that you should be very familiar with because it can be asked from you. What I recommend doing is checking out some of the documents I'm going to leave down below in the description because they could help you as well with this kind of stuff too. Informed consent is another really big thing. What does it mean to consent to treatment? Is it alright if someone doesn't consent to treatment that might be life-threatening if they don't? Stuff like that is really common to get as an ethical dilemma question, and you should be very familiar with the way the laws work in terms of allowing someone to consent to medications and their capacity. That's also a really important word. Things like that you should be very familiar with, and if you're not, don't worry, make sure you are familiar with them by the time your interview does come around. Another phrase that might get tossed around a lot as well is GILLICK competence. So this is to do with children and if they could consent to treatment themselves, and this is where the GILLICK competence comes into it as well. I do recommend researching some more about this stuff if you aren't familiar with it, and even if you are, to make sure that you brush up on it multiple times just so before your interview you have that fresh in your head. Tip number 4. This one is something I need to work on myself, and that is to speak slowly. This is just a general speaking tip because, as you know, in the setting of the MMIs, it's so fast paced. You've got a timer that's going on and you have to just give everything you know as fast as possible, and at times you might feel like you need to speak as quickly as you can, otherwise you might not say everything that you need to. Now, it is important to make sure you don't run out of time, and I'll talk a bit about time slightly later on, but make sure that everything you're saying is thought out. Think before you say whatever, and it's really important to take a few moments first before you start speaking. Don't just go straight into it. In fact, I've had an MMI so far already, and in that MMI, for every single station, I spent the first couple of seconds just thinking about what I'm going to say before I start in. It's always a good impression to be like, can I just have a few moments to think for a bit? The interviewer will be like, yeah, that's fine, and you can just sit there and just think what you're going to say, and then when you do start speaking, you know that everything you're going to be saying is going to actually be useful and will count towards the overall grade that you're going to get, that will determine whether or not you get into that university. So it's really important to speak slowly, make sure that everything that you say is thought out and important, and allow the interviewer to be able to take in everything that you say. This is especially important when it comes to role plays with an angry patient or whatever like that. You have to be very careful with the way you speak and make sure that you're not overloading the patient with whatever the situation is or whatever that's going on. Okay, speaking of time that we mentioned a bit earlier on, that's also very important. That's tip number 5. Managing time is surprisingly difficult for this because it's one thing to just give answers to whatever interview questions, but it's another thing to do that in a set time. And a lot of the times what would happen is afterward you'd feel like you didn't mention everything you wanted to, or you just completely forgot to mention something really big. And so it's important to, as you're practicing, as you get closer and closer towards your interview day, to get more and more used to doing your interview within a set time. So that's usually about like 3 or 4 minutes, and that way it will give you that urgency to make sure that you're not wasting your time, but at the same time it's going to allow you to make sure that everything that you do say is going to be important, and all the stuff that you really want to say that first, because then anything else that you want to add on, it won't be as important. So yeah, timing is very important, and so you should always try and do timed practice if you can. And the last tip I have for you, tip number 6, is to familiarize yourself with the university. This is very important as well. Obviously, the day before or a few days before you go into that university or online or however you're doing your MMI interview, make sure you're familiar with the course of the university, how the medicine course is laid out. They rarely ask you about the course in itself, but it's a good thing to mention just to show that you have been doing your research. What they are more likely to mention is, why do you want to apply to that university over other universities? They could ask you about the way the teaching is, so PBL teaching versus CBL. So those two teaching styles can vary between which universities you're studying in. So it's important to be familiar with that, because they can just straight up ask you, what about this PBL learning style do you prefer, or like, why do you prefer this learning style, or whatever, something like that. Just be very familiar with what the teaching style is like and exactly what parts of that it attracts you to the course and things like that, you know. Now we're going to do a bit of a quick fire for every single section. I'm going to give you one short and concise tip as fast as I can, so you know the sections that I mentioned at the very beginning of the video. We're going to go through every single one, and as you can hear, the music's turning up as well. We're just going to get straight into it before we move into the MMI mock at the end of the video. Okay, so for the behavioral / general type of questions, what is really important important is to be very familiar with the curveballs that they can throw at you, because there's very specific questions that can throw you off, and if you're not familiar with that type of question, you might say something that could just instantly turn you off from that station in itself, such as like, what is your greatest weakness? That can be one that's very difficult to answer, especially if it's the first time that you've heard it, and you could easily say something that might be a complete red flag for the interviewer. So familiarize yourself with those questions and chuck in your work experience as much as you can. Okay, so for roleplay, empathy is the most important thing, but sometimes empathy can just be from silence. You don't always have to be speaking. Sometimes it's more important to just let the information sink in and to give a bit of time for the patient or for whoever you're talking to just let that information sit in their head for a bit. You don't need to be constantly talking. It's more about how you can empathize with that other person, and sometimes you can just do that by simply just not saying anything. So sometimes silence is better. Now for ethics, there's no right answer. All you need to do is make sure you show both sides and which side you think is more important and what side you're going to consider. Don't sit on the fence, always pick a side, but always make sure that you do mention either side. The most important thing is to actually pick a side at the end of the day. Or once again, if you're prioritizing things, just prioritize them. You don't need to be like, well, it's wrong to prioritize or whatever. Just prioritize them and say why this is this and this is this, and just give your own thoughts. Don't be afraid that your thoughts might be wrong, because there is no right and wrong when it comes to ethics. Group tasks are a bit of a weird one. I think the most important thing you can do is to speak as early as you can, because once you start speaking at the very beginning, it's more easy to be able to continue speaking. If you don't speak from the very beginning, when it gets closer towards the end of the station and you still haven't said anything, you might just say something for the sake of saying it, and it just has no purpose whatsoever and could just become worse for you. And at the same time, if you don't say anything at all, that's even worse. You need to make sure that you're speaking with the other people and you're building some sort of relationship with them in that really short amount of time, so you can come across as someone who can actually get things done and be able to be somewhat of a sociable person, even if you're not. For data analysis type questions, all you need to do is analyze data. But I think sometimes people forget to state the obvious. Don't be afraid to show what's on the page and just state exactly what's going on before you go into the details and start explaining what is. I can't really say much about this section because there's not really much to do when it comes to data analysis, but just don't be afraid to state the obvious. Now for hot topics, this one is a bit of a strange one. It's not really that easy to just be familiar with hot topics, so over time just read as many articles as you can and as many books as you can, not for the sake of this interview but just generally so you can build up more of an idea about the course and things like that. I want you to make sure that those last couple of minutes you have before your interview to spend them going over these hot topics. Just look over the strikes, look over the competency rules, look over the GILLICK competence specifically, look over confidentiality, you know, all those things that we were talking about before. Look over all of those one more time just so they're fresh in your head, because that's something that could easily escape from you. And when it comes to NHS hot topics, always bring in those 4 pillars of medical ethics. You can always bring them in, and it's so useful when you do, because it can give you a stepping point from which you can develop your answer. And obviously when you're talking about the 4 pillars of medical ethics, you need to also talk about the NHS values as well. I mean, they're not hand in hand, but NHS values just come into so many different areas of hot topics that it's just such a useful thing that you can bring in. Not only in this section though, you can bring it in into general questions as well. Now scenario questions are a bit strange. They're pretty much just SJT questions and UCAT. My main tip for these type of questions is to not forget the non-verbal things. So it's all fine saying that you'll do this, you'll do that, you'll go through this, you'll go through that, but make sure that you do mention that you'll try and do it in as much of an empathetic way as possible. You always make sure that you respect the other person and you make sure that they feel safe with everything that's being said to them and they are understanding of everything they are being told. Things like that you will probably say in your role play, but you might forget to mention that you're going to say something like that in a scenario type question. So it's important to make sure you state those things and still make it clear that at the end of the day, that's what a doctor's meant to do. From now until the rest of the video, I'm just going to have a few questions that you can practice your MMI skills with. There's going to be a full mock MMI interview with 6 stations, and I'll give the timings as well for how long you're going to spend in each one. Feel free to get a friend to test you on these, or you could just do them by yourself and record yourself answering each one. It's completely up to you how you want to do it. There won't be any model answers though, because like I can't be asked. However, make sure you leave your replies down below in the comments if you want, and we can see what other people are saying, and hopefully you can learn a few things from each other. See you guys, good luck with your interviews. If you watched through the entire video, thank you so much, and I'll see you guys next week hopefully. Bye.